Developing this morning, the Department of Homeland Security linking multiple Democratic lawmakers in Minnesota to an illegal Somali national arrested as part of the immigration crackdown there.
At 4:20 a.m., while most American cities were still locked in silence, federal tactical teams moved at the exact moment across several states, breaking doors, flooding stairwells, and pulling Somali suspects from apartments, garages, and small offices that had looked harmless only hours earlier. ICE agents, FBI investigators, HSI units, and SWAT teams worked shoulder to shoulder, seizing fentanyl, fake prescription pills, heroin, firearms, and stacks of cash in raids that unfolded quietly but with absolute control. There were no warning sirens and no public announcements, only short commands, restrained force, and suspects taken out into the cold before neighbors even understood what was happening. This was not a random arrest or a routine drug bust, but the first visible crack in a hidden criminal system that had operated for years inside trusted neighborhoods and along ordinary highways. Subscribe to Military Power to follow this story, because what was uncovered before dawn may point to a much larger and more dangerous battle still unfolding inside the United States. The winter traffic stop unfolded under conditions that left no room for drama, yet every detail carried quiet pressure because the night itself worked against both the driver and the officers. Southern Minnesota was locked in deep cold, with temperatures far below zero. The road surface was hard and pale under the moonlight, and long stretches of highway sat empty, except for the steady hum of distant engines. The semi-truck moved slowly, its lights cutting through thin ice fog, the company logo on the trailer familiar to anyone who lived in the region, a symbol of routine freight moving through the Midwest. And there was no chase, no sudden acceleration, and no sign of panic because the stop was clean and controlled, the kind that happens thousands of times each winter when safety inspections are routine and expected. The truck eased onto the shoulder, air brakes releasing in a sharp hiss that echoed in the cold, while the patrol vehicle stayed at a measured distance, lights, steady, and calm. At that moment, the scene looked ordinary, even dull, yet the silence made every movement stand out. The officers approached with slow steps, their boots crunching against the frozen gravel, their breath visible in short bursts, their hands steady despite the cold biting through their gloves. The driver stayed seated with the window down only part way, his face tight but composed, papers already prepared, because nothing in his behavior suggested urgency or fear. The inspection began where it always begins, with weight limits and cargo documentation, because winter loads are closely monitored to prevent accidents on ice. The numbers did not align cleanly, however, with axle pressure readings exceeding the manifest's limits. A slight difference at first glance, but large enough to matter on roads this cold. The logbook raised another quiet flag, with driving times that followed a pattern too exact, too rigid, lacking the small changes that usually appear in long-haul routes shaped by weather and traffic. The officers did not rush, because in extreme cold, patience becomes a form of control, and every step had to be deliberate. As the inspection moved to the trailer, metal tools met frozen steel, and the sound rang sharp in the open night, drawing attention to the frame beneath the cargo space. The exterior appeared untouched, with clean lines, factory bolts, and no apparent damage. Yet, the structure beneath told a different story. When inspectors drilled into a section where insulation should have been soft and shallow, the resistance felt wrong, denser, deeper, and layered. The bit broke through into open space, and the change was immediate, because the hollow echo carried through the trailer frame, signaling that the interior did not match the blueprint. Panels were removed with care, screws placed methodically on the snow, each one cold enough to sting bare skin. Behind the wall sat a long, concealed compartment running nearly the entire length of the chassis, engineered to sit low and balanced, invisible to casual inspection and stable even on slick roads. Inside that hidden space, the cargo revealed itself without chaos, stacked tightly and uniformly, wrapped in layers designed to withstand moisture, cold, and handling without damage. Packages of cocaine, heroin, and fentanyl sat arranged with industrial precision. Bricks aligned like inventory rather than contraband, each bundle sealed to block scent and protect the contents during long travel. There was no smell of loose powder and no sign of haste, because this was not a hurried run, but part of a system built for repetition. The officers did not raise voices or draw weapons because there was no need, and the driver did not resist or attempt to flee because the discovery left little space for denial. Snow continued to drift across the road while evidence was documented, each step slow and exact, the cold forcing discipline on everyone involved. At first glance, the situation appeared to involve a single driver caught moving illegal cargo through a trusted route. A serious crime, but one that fit familiar patterns of highway smuggling. Yet subtle details began to suggest something broader, because the trailer modifications were too refined, the packaging too consistent, and the paperwork too clean for a lone operation. The driver did not argue or delay when questioned. Instead, he shifted quickly into cooperation, as if he understood that the stop represented more than just bad luck. His responses were measured and calm, not defensive, and his focus remained on negotiation rather than denial, a signal that his knowledge extended beyond his own role. In the stillness of that frozen roadside, it became clear that this stop had exposed a seam in a much larger structure. As questioning continued, information emerged with careful pacing, each detail adding weight to the picture forming in the background. The driver described a network of 83 truck drivers operating inside a legitimate regional hauling company, a business known across the Midwest for moving consumer goods, heating supplies, and industrial materials. This company served as a visible shell, its branding and schedules blending into daily commerce, while a specific subset of drivers followed a separate set of instructions. These drivers did not chase market demand or adjust routes for fuel prices or storms because their paths were fixed and their timing exact. They drove the same corridors repeatedly, stopped at the same terminals, and moved almost exclusively during nighttime hours when oversight was thinnest and patterns went unnoticed. The structure operated as two systems sharing the same name, one public and legal, the other hidden and criminal, running in parallel without crossing in obvious ways. Legitimate shipments filled the manifest while modified trailers carried hidden cargo beneath approved loads, their weight balanced to avoid suspicion. The driver explained that winter conditions were not an obstacle, but an advantage, because inspections dropped during extreme cold and enforcement resources shifted toward accident response. Routes were chosen to exploit that reality, moving the most significant loads when snow and ice stretched attention to a thin line. The operation relied on routine and trust, not speed or violence, making the system hard to spot until a single inspection disrupted the balance. Standing beside the open trailer, officers recognized that what had begun as a routine stop had uncovered signs of coordination, discipline, and planning on a scale that pointed far beyond a single night on a Minnesota highway. The cold air carried the weight of that realization, because the evidence suggested a network embedded inside ordinary infrastructure, using familiar roads and trusted brands as cover. This moment marked the transition from traffic enforcement to a broader investigation, one that would soon extend across state lines and draw federal attention to the highways themselves. According to you, how many routine inspections like this one are quietly hiding similar networks in plain sight? The answer to that question would shape what happened next, as attention shifted from a single truck on a frozen shoulder to a system moving unseen across the Midwest, setting the stage for the exposure of a ghost fleet operating just beyond the reach of everyday scrutiny. Winter turned the highways into quiet corridors where trucks moved as shadows and patrol cars watched without drama or noise. The modified trailers were the real weapons, built with false walls and hydraulic cavities that swallowed heavy cargo while maintaining perfect balance on ice. Panels slid and locked with pressure, leaving no loose seams, no rattles, and no signs for a passing glance. Hundreds of kilograms could sit inside a single frame, steady and hidden. The exterior remained honest, factory clean, with familiar logos untouched, blending seamlessly into regular freight flows across 5 states during winter nights in the upper Midwest region. Routes never changed because predictability was protection, and timing mattered more than speed or distance. Drivers left terminals after dark, followed fixed corridors, and reached the same stops with clock-like precision. No detours appeared on logs, no pauses for weather, no variation for traffic, which kept patterns invisible inside routine. Winter storms contributed to an increase in thinning inspections, leading police to focus on accidents and rescues. Snow reduced visibility, cold shortened roadside checks, and long nights covered movement. The system relied on patience, repetition, and trust within everyday commerce across multiple states during peak shipping seasons, without raising alarms or drawing attention from nearby authorities. Law enforcement pressure felt distant during storms, yet planning accounted for that gap with care. Fewer troopers stayed outside, scanners froze, and routine checks shortened, creating windows that stretched for hours. Trucks rolled through whiteout conditions, their tires biting into the ice, their engines steady, their drivers calm. Cargo stayed silent behind steel and composite walls, immune to weather and motion. Money traveled the same way, vacuum-sealed and stacked, prepared for export. Weapons parts were also moved, broken down, and boxed, passing as harmless freight. Every movement followed schedules approved within the shadow network, which quietly crossed borders each night without visible disruption in public. This was not street crime fueled by impulse or fear, but organized conflict shaped by systems and discipline. No guns flashed on highways, no sirens screamed, yet power moved steadily through logistics. Each trailer functioned as a cell, each route as a line of supply, and each storm as cover. The violence remained indirect, measured in poison delivered and money extracted rather than blood spilled. The battlefield stretched across states, hidden in invoices and fuel stops, making detection slow, and the consequences wide for communities that depended on constant freight movement, which was rarely noticed by them each passing night alone. When federal planners stepped in, restraint ended, and synchronization began across agencies and states. The decision rejected piecemeal arrest because any warning could scatter drivers and erase evidence. Approval came from the highest levels, and preparation moved quietly through winter days. Teams studied routes, terminals, and timing, mapping movement with precision. The operation received a name that signaled force without making a sound. Northern Breaker waited for the moment when trucks filled the roads again under snow and darkness across the Midwest transportation grid, while agents rehearsed entry seizures and arrests repeatedly until the timing aligned with full network activity during peak nights. The takedown unfolded as a series of parallel actions rather than a single point of impact. On frozen highways, rolling box maneuvers cleared space around convoys, forcing heavy rigs onto the shoulders without causing chaos. Doors opened, drivers stepped down, and restraints followed in seconds. At headquarters, armored vehicles pushed through gates as teams poured inside. Warehouses filled with shouts and commands, boots moving fast across concrete. Transfer hubs fell at the same time, cutting off movement and communication, so nothing escaped the coordinated net that morning across multiple states during active winter storms, with strict timing and silent control maintained by federal teams everywhere simultaneously. Seizures followed the action with methodical speed as evidence was moved from trailers and offices into secure custody. Narcotics wrapped in carbon-treated layers defeated dogs until exposed, then stacked high for counting. Cash appeared in sealed bricks, ready for transfer, marked for foreign routes. Weapon parts surfaced from crates labeled as machinery, stripped and cataloged piece by piece. Financial drives and dispatch systems were lifted intact, preserving records of movement and payment that mapped years of activity across trusted companies worth more than $85 million in laundering linked to organized supply networks spanning 5 states under false identities abroad. By dawn, the network lay frozen in place, its movement halted, and its camouflage stripped away. Drivers, coordinators, and mechanics sat detained as trucks waited silently behind tape. The scale became clear through absence, as shipments failed to arrive and terminals stood still. Communities felt disruption without knowing its cause, while agents worked through cold hours documenting proof. The conflict ended without gunfire, yet its impact spread widely, reaching beyond arrests into the structure of everyday trade and security planning across the Midwest, which depended on uninterrupted logistics and trust built over decades of routine operations now exposed publicly nationwide. Officers recognized that force alone had not won this fight because discipline and timing mattered more. Every step followed a plan designed to avoid panic, injury, or escape. The arrests felt controlled rather than chaotic, reflecting the nature of the enemy itself. This was organized crime adapted to modern infrastructure, challenged by organized enforcement, adapted in response. The moment closed one chapter, but pressure remained as attention turned toward money trails and hidden partners waiting to be uncovered beyond the highways that had carried illegal cargo without suspicion for years under legitimate branding across the American Midwest region until intervention arrived. The silence that followed the action felt heavier than the noise as snow continued to fall on the cleared scenes. Trucks sat locked, gates stayed closed, and roads returned to their quiet flow. For those involved, the cold carried a lesson about vulnerability inside standard systems. The conflict had been hidden in routine, exposed by patience, and ended through coordination. What followed would delve deeper into finances and oversight, where the next phase lay beyond the asphalt and steel that once masked criminal activity, effectively linking this operation to broader federal campaigns still unfolding across logistics networks nationwide in the weeks following the arrests. The next section follows the pressure outward from these arrests, tracing how frozen routes and seized data pushed investigators toward the money and the structure behind it. It shifts focus from steel and snow to accounts and transfers, illustrating how control on the road paved the way for access to financial systems. What began with trailers and timing now moves into ledgers, codes, and hidden exchanges, setting the stage for a deeper confrontation that extends beyond transportation and will define the investigation moving forward for authorities, revealing the full reach of the network across borders and institutions alike in the following analysis section ahead. The money trail surfaced the same way the trucks had, through controlled pressure and quiet force applied at the right points. Agents moved through offices, storage rooms, and dispatch centers, having already marked files and targeted specific computers. Hard drives were pulled while screens still glowed, phones were bagged before calls could be made, and paper records were stacked under armed watch. No shouting filled these rooms, only short commands and the scrape of chairs on concrete floors. Every action is focused on freezing movement, because money moves faster than trucks when it senses danger. Investigators followed the flow without hesitation, tracing more than $85 million that never passed through regular banks. Transfers appeared small on the surface, broken into harmless-looking amounts, yet together they formed a steady river of cash. The Hawala system carried value without moving currency, relying on trust and coded messages instead of wires. Agents watched as names linked across continents, connecting Midwest offices to brokers far away. Screens filled with numbers and timestamps, while officers guarded doors, ensuring that nothing vanished while the system lay exposed. Shell companies appeared everywhere once the freeze began, their names plain and forgettable, their addresses shared by dozens of entities that existed only on paper. The files showed no warehouses, no workers, and no real services, yet millions passed through them. Agents photographed ledgers and sealed boxes of documents, each page revealing another layer of disguise. The work felt slow but heavy, because every discovery confirmed the value of planning and patience. This was not a fast crime, but rather a careful construction, designed to hide behind rules and paperwork that few people ever question. As accounts locked and terminals closed, the impact spread outward across the Midwest. Trucks sat idle, gates stayed shut, and schedules collapsed within hours. Food deliveries missed windows, fuel shipments stalled, and factories waited for parts that never arrived. Dispatch boards went dark, leaving drivers stranded and customers confused. Officers stood watch as evidence teams cataloged assets, knowing that disruption was part of the cost. The network had woven itself so deeply into daily life that removing it caused visible strain across communities that relied on constant movement. The arrests continued alongside the financial seizure, with teams escorting suspects from offices and warehouses under tight control. Hands were cuffed, heads lowered, and doors closed behind them. There was no spectacle, only the methodical removal of key figures tied to payments and coordination. Agents carried boxes of seized cash, vacuum sealed and labeled for export, lifting them into armored vehicles waiting in the cold. Each load represented weeks of poison, delivered and trust abused, now cut off by force and timing. This exposure reframed the threat in clear terms, because the trucks were no longer just vehicles, but tools shaped into weapons. They carried more than cargo, moving influence and harm through trusted channels. Highways became lines of attack, and paperwork became camouflage. Officers recognized that protection could not stop at borders or ports, because danger traveled through familiar routes. Security now meant watching ordinary systems with the same care given to obvious threats, understanding that the most effective attacks often wear familiar faces. The weight of the operation settled in as evidence rooms filled and streets stayed quiet. Snow-covered, impounded trucks and silence returned to yards once full of movement. Agents reviewed data late into the night, mapping links that extended beyond arrests already made. The network had been frozen, but its shadow lingered, pointing to partners and accounts that were still active elsewhere. Each file promised another door to open, another corridor to secure, as the scale of the operation continued to unfold. What followed would push beyond logistics and seizures, shifting focus toward the people and structures that allowed this system to exist for years. What began as a single winter traffic stop on a quiet stretch of highway ultimately exposed a system that had spanned state lines, operated quietly through trusted companies, and had survived for years without drawing public attention. One truck on a frozen shoulder exposed a network built on discipline, routine, and patience, proving that modern criminal operations no longer rely on chaos or street violence to survive. Instead, they hide inside everyday life, using schedules, paperwork, and familiar logos to move drugs, money, and influence without resistance. The scale of what followed showed how quickly an ordinary moment can become a turning point when enforcement pressure is applied in the right place at the right time. This case made clear that modern crime does not always look dangerous on the surface, because its strength often comes from appearing clean, dull, and legitimate. Trucks carried company names. People recognized routes, followed rules that looked professional, and documents passed inspections designed to protect commerce, not expose betrayal. The system worked because trust existed at every level, from loading docks to highways to bank records, allowing illegal activity to move inside structures built for honest work. That is what made the network so compelling and so challenging to detect, and also what made its collapse so disruptive once the truth came into view. Operation Northern Breaker did more than remove drugs and weapons from circulation, because it exposed how deeply criminal systems can embed themselves into the economic engine of the country. When the operation froze accounts and shut down terminals, the impact extended far beyond those arrested, affecting supply chains that millions of people rely on every day. Food deliveries slowed, fuel shipments stalled, and factories waited for parts that never arrived, all because one criminal network had infiltrated the flow of daily life. This disruption demonstrated that the threat was not limited to crime statistics, but extended to national stability and public trust. At the same time, Northern Breaker was not a clean ending, but a warning signal. The arrests halted one network, yet the methods it employed are not unique, and the conditions that allowed it to grow persist. Systems built on speed, scale, and trust remain vulnerable to exploitation by groups willing to wait, adapt, and hide in plain sight. The operation demonstrated that enforcement can strike back with coordination and precision, but it also highlighted the considerable effort required to detect threats that do not announce themselves through violence. This is why the story does not end with seized trucks and locked gates. It continues in audits, oversight, and pressure applied to industries that were never designed to defend against organized crime from within. The lesson is uncomfortable but clear, because security is no longer only about borders or street patrols, but about understanding how ordinary systems can be turned against the people who rely on them. Highways, logistics, and supply chains have become quiet front lines, where control and awareness matter as much as force. Subscribe to Military Power to continue following these invisible battles inside the United States, where law enforcement and criminal networks clash far from the headlines and far from public view. In your view, do operations like this help stabilize order, or are they creating a dangerous precedent for the future of America's supply chain?